Cleavages, which corresponds with topics 3.8 and 3.9 in the AP Comparative Government course description, getting you ready for those concepts and specific content that is fair game for this revised AP exam for AP Comparative Government, May 22nd. So welcome back. If you have been watching, I teach at AP Comparative Government and AP US Government in the suburbs of Chicago at Adlai E. Stevenson High School. I would invite you to download the course description I showed you yesterday in the lesson on 3.7 on civil liberties and civil rights, how you can really use that course description as a study guide to understand a lot of the specific content and the concepts that are fair game on this exam that's focused on units 1, 2, and 3. There's a more specific link, and feel free to go to citizenu.org. It's the Two Teachers website put together by Mr. Dan Larson, who is Mr. Review on TikTok. If you're looking for some AP US Government short little video reviews, check out citizenu.org for US Government. But if you go to Comparative Corner, Mr. Larson has put my readings that correspond with my supplemental notes that you see on these PowerPoint slides, and the special announcement at the end of today's lesson. I think he's put something else in there. I will get to that later. Make sure as you're using the web to prep for this AP exam and other AP exams that you might be signed up to take, to go to the College Board's AP coronavirus updates for more specific information, times, dates, what type of questions are fair game. We had shout outs, another shout out from Nigeria, by the way. Our streak is back on with Nigerian political activists using our hashtag APCompGov2020 now on a regular basis to voice concerns about coronavirus aid from different levels of government in Nigeria. Also, Paulina, thank you very much. A very pertinent, on-topic example. Yesterday, we were talking about civil liberties. We were talking about how authoritarian governments are much more likely to have state control of broadcast media to the point where they control content, where the content on a broadcast media in an authoritarian government is only going to uphold what the government wants its citizens to hear. And Paulina gave a really good example in China of Xinhua, which is Chinese state media that broadcasts what the Communist Party and the Chinese state government wants its citizens and the world to know about China, particularly as we saw a lot of censored news about coronavirus, particularly early on in Wuhan, China. And oh my gosh, I couldn't resist. We've been kind of down on memes lately at hashtag APCompGov2020. So I wanted to make my own weak attempt at a meme. Oh, that's so sad. Without 2 days of AP Comp Gov, what are you gonna do? Oh, Big Papa is sad. And the only reason I know Big Papa is my children have been trying to encourage me and my wife to get a dog during the lockdown. I am absolutely against the idea, and they tried to shatter my heart by saying how sad a dog would be without being in the Canine household. So that is Big Papa, sad to be 2 days without comparative government lessons. Also, if you're looking for something to do, if you're looking for a side project, and I know we have a lot of dialogue on the social media and hashtag APCompGov2020. Teachers, if you're watching, if you know those students who are go-getters, who want to take their knowledge from AP Comparative Government and apply it to different governmental reforms, I'd invite you to check out projectcivicsworks.org. It's a political science fair. We're trying to recruit students from across the country, particularly AP Comparative Government students with all their knowledge of different political structures. We're going to be looking at Unit 4 real quick on the next lesson. We're looking at voting systems. Oh, some really interesting ideas out there about reforms at the national, state, or local level of what students see happening around the world when it comes to different election systems. So if you have an idea, all it takes is 5 to 8 presentation slides and you get a complimentary t-shirt, Democracy is a Verb. Check out the website for rules, a sample. And if you want to see what that t-shirt looks like, if you're interested. I left off yesterday. I was desperate for a quantitative analysis example for topics 3.8 and 3.9 as we look at political and social cleavages. I don't know if you heard, I was practically begging for an example to be shared, and no examples were shared. I was disappointed with that, but I used my Google machine, and just a quick search, didn't take too long, so I was happy with that, where I found some really interesting data from FERDI. I didn't even know what FERDI was. It's the Foundation for International Research and Development. It's a French think tank of political scientists, comparativists, who study internal violence and violence across the developing world. And they have about 130 questions that they have data for their internal violence index scores. I did not know this existed until yesterday evening, but this is the data we're going to take for today's quantitative analysis. And again, the internet machine is incredible. Just typed in political violence index, and out pops this data from comparativists, really interesting data from 5 of our 6 countries. So get ready for a quantitative analysis question regarding this data. I'll show you later. And I'll show you some skills when you get something that maybe takes you back, some skills, some literacy skills when it comes to data analysis that pertains to today's lesson. Again, we are talking about political and social cleavages. This is the last specific topic lesson from Unit 3 as we have made our way through Units 1, 2, and 3. We're comparing this, connecting this topic, again, a lot to democratization and the difference between democracy and authoritarianism, power and authority, federal unitary states, a lot of topics that we've talked about previously connect to political and social cleavages. Lots of content to get through, so I'm going to get into that. Again, you can see the schedule. We're about to get into some unit reviews and then perhaps some test prep on the week before AP tests begin. Critical vocab, when you go through the course description for 3.8 and 3.9, you'll see some critical vocabulary. It's not highlighted or bolded the way I do in the slides, but certainly if you read critically, you're going to recognize key vocab. So today we're going back to an oldie and a goodie, political stability. You might even see a reference to political stability in the quantitative analysis. Cleavages, social and political cleavages. This is the first time we've seen this as a vocab word. Remember, cleavages are divisions in society or in politics. And when you speak about cleavages, and there's no questions today in the FRQs asking you to describe a social or political cleavage, but you have to usually describe 2 sides. So it could be 2 religious factions, it could be 2 geographical factions, it could be racial or ethnic factions. But if you're ever asked to describe a cleavage, a social political cleavage, and I don't think you would see that in the way that the questions are structured for 2020, but you really do have to describe both sides of that. Separatist movement, that's a term we've seen before as well. Certainly we know that a number of our countries, these different political and social cleavages are connected to groups that are trying to break away from a larger country. And then it's a term I've used before with the word coercion, but in today's course description, you see this term called brute repression, which obviously is a more violent, a much more invasive form of coercion that you would typically see more in an authoritarian government as a way to suppress the actions of governmental opponents. So getting into specific examples, again, anything you see with an asterisk is coming straight from that course description. So you can see there's a lot of specific notes about our 6 AP countries today that are listed in the AP course description. I've added some kind of supplemental notes to give you a little bit more context in some cases. I'm going to be going through these fast, so please go back to that course description, read through topic 3.8 and 3.9. You're going to see a lot of country-specific information. I know that many of you have already covered these countries case by case, so you might be really well versed in the countries that you covered before you had to leave school. And I know, in some cases you didn't get to a couple of countries before we went to remote learning. So when in doubt, if you're looking for what do I have to know about China or Nigeria specifics, go to that course description and then look for those specific examples, particularly from units 1, 2, and 3. So with China, you should know that the Han Chinese are the ethnic majority in China, but the Chinese government does officially recognize 55 different ethnic minority groups, so including Tibetans who are in the predominantly Muslim province, Xinjiang in northwest China, and ethnic Tibetans who are predominantly in Tibet and southwest China. So it's interesting that this is an example of governments typically have 3 different types of responses to social cleavages. And one of them is recognition, to recognize land rights or language rights. Another could be representation, to actually grant certain ethnic minorities or religious minorities seats in a legislative chamber. And the other is repression, to use brute repression or coercion as a way to force an assimilation of a certain group of peoples into that country, into that nation, if you will, and to put down separatist movements. And you see that with China. You see all 3 of those. You see representation in the National People's Congress of peoples who are from Tibet in Xinjiang in this specific example. You see, legal recognition of language rights. Tibet and Xinjiang are recognized as what's called special autonomous zones in China. So legally on paper, it looks like there are special land rights and language rights, but we know that oftentimes the government is abusing those rights, particularly when it comes to religious civil liberties in both Tibet and Xinjiang. And we know that we see examples of repression, in some cases brute repression, particularly now in Xinjiang, where you have these mass detention camps, where it's estimated that hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs are held in these camps to indoctrinate this ethnic minority, to learn the Chinese language, to try to suppress any chance of a separatist movement. Certainly the Chinese government authorities talk about these acts of governmental coercion being needed because there have been instances of political violence and terrorism, specifically in Xinjiang, are related to separatist movements by Uyghurs. And so the Chinese state authorities talk about the need for this type of brute repression or more force to put down these acts of political violence and to force the assimilation of the Uyghur Muslim minority population within China. So lots of journalism about this. And so this would be an example of repression, recognition, and also representation to some degree in China. In Iran, the course description wants you to know that Iran's a particularly diverse country. You do have a Shia Muslim majority in Iran, but you also have a substantial number of Sunni Muslims in Iran. And you do have religious minorities, Christians, Jews. Iran has the largest Jewish population in the Middle East outside of Israel, and for millennia. And you have a group of Zoroastrians, and the government and the Constitution of Iran actually gives some special protections to, or it states that there are special religious protections. I've mentioned before that the Constitution guarantees certain number of seats, although it's very few seats, for religious minorities in the national legislation. But we also know that there have been examples of repression of religious minorities, particularly Baha'is, and that's not in the notes. I probably should have put the idea that the Baha'i, practitioners of Baha'i, are persecuted by Iran's government. They're treated as apostates and can face harassment, imprisonment, and different other examples of repression or brute repression, and some examples towards that Baha'i religious minority in Iran. In Mexico, you see divisions, particularly north and south. The north is more affluent in Mexico. The south is more rural. it is less affluent. The north is more likely where you're going to see factories and some of those industrial jobs. You also see ethnic divisions in Mexico with the indigenous or Amerindian populations of the south and the more rural areas of Mexico, contrasted with whites and mestizos. 1994 was a really critical example of these social cleavages in Mexico, particularly with the southern state of Chiapas, where you saw this indigenous peoples organize. There was examples of political violence in that. The government has initially responded with violence, but Mexico's national government has responded with different policy reduction policies or attempts to reduce poverty in certain impoverished southern areas of Mexico, try to expand land rights. So there have been attempts by Mexico's central government to address these differences, but certainly there is still disagreement as to the extent that those policies have been successful to try to reduce poverty in rural, more indigenous Mexico in the south. Nigeria, if you've studied Nigeria, you know it's the largest, the most populous country in Africa, and incredibly diverse, both through languages and tribes, ethnicities, and religion, and geographically. No shortage of social and political cleavages in Nigeria, with the number of different ethnic groups. And the three main ethnic groups that most textbooks cover are the Hausa Fulani, predominantly Muslim in the north, and Yoruba in the west, and Igbo in the east. But you also see religious differences between north and south, with the north predominantly Muslim. That's where you see Sharia law practiced in some of those northern states, where the south is predominantly Christian. And you see economic differences too. The north in Nigeria, more rural, more agricultural. The south is more likely to have the bigger cities, industries, particularly related to the oil industry in the Niger River Delta. And you see a lot of times those cleavages have played out in different political crises of the government having to respond to protests by those who are upset with environmental degradation or the infringement on indigenous people's rights in the Niger River Delta. And more recently with Boko Haram and other Islamist groups, including the infiltration by ISIS, the Islamic State, for the better part of the last 10 years, particularly between the years of 2010 to 2015, you saw mass kidnappings, the Chibok girls of 2014. You've seen over 25,000 people killed throughout the country, almost 2 million people displaced, according to the United Nations, because of this violence by the separatist groups, these Islamist groups, trying to seize territory and essentially create their own government or religious caliphate in that parts of northern Nigeria in response to what they see as the too much westernization of Nigeria. So that would be an example of social cleavages in Nigeria that the government has had tremendous difficulty trying to tackle violence related to that. Similarly, in Russia, you have had a history of, well, Russia, again, enormous country geographically, but also through language, through religion, through ethnicity. And you particularly see this with the majority Russian Orthodox population, the Christian Russian Orthodox population, but particularly in areas in the south of Russia, particularly in the Caucasus region of Chechnya. For the better part of 10 years, you had a war in southern Russia in that region where you had a Muslim minority throughout Russia, but a majority of the population in southern Russia trying to break away in the separatist movement. You saw two different wars fought there in the 1990s and into the early 2000s. And you've seen a number of instances, even fairly recently, of terrorism related to the separatist movement and political violence related to Islamist groups throughout Russia, not just in that particular region in southern Russia. Russia, again, they fought, the military fought 2 wars in this particular area to try to prevent the separatist movement. Putin put in place in terms of brute repression, a guy named Ramzan Kadyrov. I've used his name before, and he is still in charge in Chechnya. And so you don't see a separatist movement the way you did in the 1990s and the early 2000s, but that's partly because of the repression that this authoritarian leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, has used to implement Sharia law, to certainly using Russian funds to rebuild the capital city of Grozny, different mosques, but you've seen very heavy use of repression and coercion, violence to silence those opponents in that particular area. And like I said, you've seen political violence related to this, particularly when ISIS was growing in strength in Syria, and you saw some ISIS fighters in Russia as well committing acts of terrorism. Between those 5 years, 2010 to 2015, you had over 300 people killed, including a major plane crash related to terrorism. And it wasn't just in that southern area of Russia, also Moscow had some significant acts of terrorism and political violence related to that. United Kingdom, certainly an example of different cleavages are the different nations of the United Kingdom: Scotland, England, Wales, Ireland with Northern Ireland. You see in Northern Ireland the big cleavages between the Protestants and the Roman Catholics of Northern Ireland. For much, and you also see the cleavages in this very diverse United Kingdom, particularly with immigration from South Asia. And the very cosmopolitan nature of London and different British cities. So what's notable in terms of cleavages and political violence has been particularly from 1969 until 1998, you had what's called the Troubles. And this is essentially a military occupation by the military of the United Kingdom in Northern Ireland to try to put down a separatist movement by Roman Catholics who were using acts of terrorism and political violence to try to break Northern Ireland away from the United Kingdom. And over the course of 1969 to 1998, the better part of 30 years, you saw over 3,000 people killed as part of this political violence and acts of terrorism. And by the late 1990s, the British government started negotiating with the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, which was this terrorist group, according to British authorities. And they came up with what's called the Good Friday Agreement, or it's otherwise known as the Belfast Agreement, where essentially the United Kingdom was using devolution, giving more powers to the regional government of Northern Ireland, but also instilling what's called executive power sharing, ensuring that leaders who were Protestant and leaders who were Roman Catholic would share governmental powers as a way to try to minimize and reduce that political violence. And so you see the government responding to the United Kingdom's government responding to religious cleavages and social cleavages that way in the United Kingdom. We know that cleavages results in different voting behavior in different party systems, particularly in the United Kingdom. You see a lot of social cleavages related to class, the working class versus the upper class, and the working class historically voting for the Labour Party, and the upper class historically voting for the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. And we've talked about how different course countries have responded to social cleavages and some of the political consequences. I've mentioned here specifically this commonality between Nigeria and Russia with radical Islamists and terrorism related to, and political violence related to particularly separatist movements in those two countries. And we've talked about brute repression, or the state responding to cleavages, particularly, or social separatist movements with violence. Also of note, again, some of these kind of repeat themselves, the idea that cleavages can lead to conflict They can undermine political legitimacy, particularly, you're going to see this in the FRQs I wrote today, particularly if that violence seems to threaten political stability. It can certainly affect political legitimacy if the government looks incapable of stopping violence, particularly mass acts of political violence or acts of terrorism. Let's see, what else is particularly, we've talked about the Zapatistas, other groups demanding autonomy but not independence have emerged in Mexico. I've mentioned the Zapatistas before in southern Mexico. You know, Wales, and I think Wales and Scotland and the United Kingdom would fit into this. Certainly the Welsh have nationalist pride and wanted more powers for the regional government. Scotland might be the more prominent example in the United Kingdom, particularly because of that 2014 referendum on independence and Scottish voters voting as to whether to remain in the United Kingdom, which a majority did support at that time, or to withdraw from the United Kingdom. And if in your class, your teachers probably talked about or had you research the European Union and Brexit, and you might be aware that Scottish voters tend to be much more in favor of the United Kingdom maintaining a relationship with the European Union. So there's some hypotheticals out there, predictions that depending on how the United Kingdom ends up withdrawing from the European Union, it could have ramifications for Scottish independence from the United Kingdom, but that's yet to be determined. We know that the last time Scottish voters voted, a majority voted to remain in the United Kingdom. And that's the last we've heard from that story. I think that pretty much covers it. You know, teachers out there, I really want to encourage you. I know we're in a revised exam that only focuses on the argument essay and the quantitative analysis, but I really want to emphasize that, you know, if you teach country by country or teach thematically, when we go back to a future exam that's a full exam with the 4 different types of free responses, these topics 3.8 and 3.9, they're really contemporary. They give a lot of current examples that students tend to be interested in researching, a lot of troubles on how do governments respond to different cleavages. And they are really interesting topics, 3.8 and 3.9, that you can write a lot of different types of free response questions for the 4 different types of free responses that we would expect in an ordinary AP comparative exam year. But this is not an ordinary year. This is 2020, and we know that it's focused only on the argument essay and the quantitative analysis. But even though I'm going to give you a quantitative analysis, students, go through 3.8, 3.9, read a little bit more closely than the time I'm putting in here, and you're going to see a lot of good potential argument essays, like this idea of undermining, how do cleavages undermine legitimacy? Or even this reference to securing stability in a multinational state. So a country that has a lot of different nations, has a lot of different diversity. What are the challenges that governments face in securing stability? And so there's really good potential for possible argument essays, even though today's question, I'm focusing on a quantitative analysis. If you have other examples of governmental responses to political and social cleavages, whether it be recognition, representation, or that should not say response, but that should say repression, which we certainly see in some of our countries. If you have other examples, please share those to the hashtag APCompGov 2020. I always do 5 multiple choice questions before we get into our FRQ of the day. So today's first multiple choice question, which of the following is a correct pairing of social cleavages to the country? And let's do 3 of these. We have a pair of countries here, Iran and Nigeria. Which is the correct pairing of social cleavages to Iran and Nigeria? And hopefully you knew that Iran has a Persian majority in Azerbaijani and Kurdish minorities, whereas in Nigeria, Muslims tend to live predominantly in the north, Christians predominantly in the south, and of course you have that middle belt in Nigeria with tremendous religious diversity in Nigeria. So that would be the best answer for the first question. Question number 2, which of the following is a correct pairing of social cleavages to the country? In this case, we have the countries of the United Kingdom and China. And review your options here. And here we have letter D. You have English in the Southwest, Irish in the Northwest, Northern Ireland of the United Kingdom, whereas in China, Uyghurs in the Northwest and Tibetans in the Southwest. I guess English should be in the Southeast, shouldn't it? That would be wrong. The Southeast of the United Kingdom, with Irish in the Northwest, Tibetans in the Southwest. We'll correct that right after. How about which of the following is a correct pairing of social cleavages to the country? We have Russia and Mexico. And in this case, you should know that Mexico has the cleavages of Orthodox Christian and Chechen Muslims, where Mexico has the cleavages of Amerindians and mestizos. But which of the following is defined by the significant use of governmental coercion to enact state objectives? So which of those refers to significant governmental coercion? And hopefully you now know that the answer to that is brute repression. And finally, which of the following methods will be defined by the United Kingdom's formal power sharing agreement for the governing of Northern Ireland between the leaders who are Protestant and Roman Catholic? And the answer to this is representation, the idea of representing different religious or ethnic cleavages as part of government. So that takes us through the multiple choice. You know that this exam will have no multiple choice questions on it. Instead, you'll see 2 free response questions. The first one being the argument essay, which I've covered in several of the previous lessons, previous to 3.8 and 3.9. But I want to make sure I wrap up Unit 3 with a quantitative analysis. We think this is going to be 3 points. If in fact it is 3 points, you have to consider it this way. I know we've spent a lot of time on the argument essay. The argument essays were 7 points. So if the quantitative analysis is worth 3 points, you're talking about 10 total points in FRQ writing. We know that the quantitative analysis is worth 45% of your total exam score. You can do the math. That means if this is worth 3 points, each of those points is a mega point in the quantitative analysis. And as much as you might be concerned with the argument essay writing, I really need to encourage you to take each of these, again, we're assuming this is 3 points in the quantitative analysis. I need you to take each of those 3 points really seriously and really make sure you are maximizing your opportunity to score each of those 3 points on the quantitative analysis. Because again, even though it's worth less in terms of number of points, each of those points is a mega point. So with that in mind, I showed you before the data set I found from what's called the Internal Violence Index, which is put together by this French think tank. Here's the website if you want to check it out. When you get a data set or a graph or a line graph, particularly if you see some footnotes, you got to use your literacy skills when you're looking at the data. Okay, you got to read something. It's not just about the numbers. In some cases, the numbers are actually the easiest part of the data. But you also need to read your title, you need to read your X and your Y axis labels, and you need to read footnotes, because I would really, really strongly suggest that as you're answering your prompts, you reuse words from the title, reuse words from your labels, reuse words from the footnote in some cases. Look at the dates. The dates are interesting. It's 2008 to 2012. That's significant. It's also significant. We're not talking about, when you see these numbers, what are those numbers? Well, we know what those numbers are. They're index scores. These are scores. So this is similar to what Freedom House does, by giving scores to different countries based on civil liberties and political rights. Well, in this case, political scientists, they're telling in the footnote that these are scores that have been normalized into a score ranging from 0 on the minimum to 100 on the maximum. So I really want to invite you to make sure you use your literacy skill when you see a data set so that you can incorporate these words from the title, from the labels, from the footnote into your answers to make sure you're being really, really careful to try to maximize your opportunity to earn these mega points in the quantitative analysis. So with that said, and I'm going to go back to that data, here are the 3 questions, A, B, and C, that I've written for that data set. And this will be your FRQ number 2. You'll have 15 minutes to write this. This is worth 45% of your total score. And again, we're assuming that this is worth 3 points. And we have it labeled as A, B, and C. So A, explain how a pattern of data in the table relates to the state's use of brute repression in China. So again, we're connecting data to, we have this country-specific example, but you got to speak to a vocabulary word, to a concept, in this case, brute repression. Letter B, using data in the table, draw a conclusion. You're going to see that directive, draw a conclusion about political and social cleavages. So there's our topic of the day, and it's specific to Nigeria. And then letter C, explain how data in the table relates to political stability in Russia and Nigeria. So now we have 2 countries. And again, we got to connect data in the table to political stability. So again, I'm going to take you back to the data. And we should be able to find specific data for all the different countries. And the key to doing well in the quantitative analysis is now you have to think conceptually. We were just given 3 different concepts: brute repression, social cleavages, and political stability. And you now have to think conceptually, connect to that data. All right. So this is where your preparations of preparing ahead of time for this AP exam, and not just relying on, oh my gosh, it's open book, so I can look up notes. You don't want to cram for this exam or just rely on open notes and think it's going to be easy. You really do have to try to master and prepare to understand the different concepts, particularly those concepts from unit 1, 2, and 3 that we've been speaking to. So let's see how I try to do this. There's a lot of different ways you can answer this. I was just grading a batch of FRQs from my own students earlier today, and they did really well, but there's always some, and you know, you have classmates, or maybe you're this person too, they always try to answer with the fewest words possible, a couple of students. And so particularly for the quantitative analysis, I try to give you some examples of short answers that are not getting the point, to try to show you how some students write. And I'm trying to encourage you guys to really maximize your writing so that you can maximize your chance to win these mega points in the quantitative analysis. So this first one, this is not wrong up here. It's on task. A pattern of data relates to brute repression in China because China has relatively low index scores of deaths due to internal armed conflicts and terrorist incidents. That is correct. But that by itself is not going to get the point for this question, even though it's speaking to the question. You know, you've heard me say before, any question that says explain how, or draw a conclusion, or provide a reason for the argument essay, that is AP code. Explain how, draw a conclusion, explain a reason. That's AP code for make sure you have a statement of causation. There's a lot of ways to give a statement of causation. The easiest way, I think, is to include a because word, but it's the English language, and you guys are good writers, and you can be creative. There's a lot of ways to show causation. I tend to stick with because, or due to, or therefore. That's my personal preference, to keep this as kind of simple and straightforward to teach you as possible. But you're not getting the point, the mega point, for A, B, or C in this question unless you actually use specific data. So if this is the first time you've watched me do a quantitative analysis, don't take the easy way out and not use the data. Just don't describe the data, use specific data. So that's how I've written this question for letter A. I've tried to use the specific data. I've essentially said what I said in this top part, which I think is incomplete and not going to get that mega point. And I'm much more complete in this bottom section by making sure I link my answer specifically to the data. So internal armed conflict, the score is 1.63. Terrorist incident, the score is 16.8. I gotta admit, when I started writing this, I started using the wrong words, and I could have shown you the example. I started talking about the rate, and for some reason I was using the rate of violence in China. And that's why I kind of pointed out specifically today, make sure you use the words from the title or the labels or the footnote into your answers. These aren't rates. These aren't, it's not measuring that there were 92.95 deaths in Russia. These aren't concrete numbers. They've been normalized into an index score that we're being told that in the footnote. And so if you see extra notes that are added into a data set, in some cases it means something. Now don't overanalyze, but particularly look at titles. Titles matter. So try to use that language in your answer. So I really try to emphasize, we're talking about index scores, and I specifically list the index scores. And so that's where you can use your literacy skills and then your good writing skills to really communicate clearly, what is this data saying? And that's where you index scores, use the numbers, and then you explain how. How does this pattern of data connect to the concept? And only one more thing I have to say about pattern of data. Remember, pattern of data or trend, if you see those words, pattern of data or trend, that is code for you have to have at least 2 pieces of data in your answer. And so we have a number of different data here. I've chosen 2 for China on the deaths due to internal armed conflicts and terrorist incident, because when I read pattern or trend, I know I got to have at least 2. If you want to put 3, if you want to put more, if that fits your answer, go for it. But you have to have at least 2 data points to make sure that you're describing a trend or a pattern. In this case, it used the word pattern. So I've talked about that. The pattern of data could reflect China's use of brute repression against Uyghur separatists, because these relatively low scores could reflect the impacts of China's use of brute repression, including strict monitoring, mass detention, and indoctrination to minimize violence by Uyghur separatists in China. So that was my answer. You're not getting that mega point unless you actually explain how. So you have to add something after the because. I personally think you really need to try to prove to the reader that you know what this concept is. So if the concept is asking about brute repression, you need to connect your answer, country specific, China, to an example of brute repression. So I try to do that with the strict monitoring, mass detention, and indoctrination, that content I was sharing with you earlier. I'm going to speed through this a little bit more quickly, but to win the mega point, to earn the mega point, to draw a conclusion, again, you have to explain how. I think you need a because to draw a conclusion. And again, use specific data. In this case, I use 3 points of data here to draw a conclusion about Nigeria. I've reused the terminology from the title. We're talking about index scores. And in this case, I'm saying that of the countries listed, Nigeria has the highest index scores. And then I specifically list these to get the point. When you read the example up here, you're going to see I didn't list any data. If you're going to get the point, you got to use the data for this. A conclusion could be drawn from this data is that Nigeria struggled to minimize violence related to its political and social cleavages, because violence by Boko Haram Islamist groups toward Christians in Nigeria is reflected in these high index scores. So here's where I was mentioning before, if you're trying to prove that you know about ethnic cleavages or political cleavages or social cleavages, if that's what the question's asking you to do, and you're trying to show off that you know that, make sure you give an example. You could write a definition, but give an example here of the cleavage that we're talking about is Islamist separatist groups, and the other side of that cleavage is Christians. And you can connect your data in drawing a conclusion to you proving to the reader that you know what this concept is, political and social cleavages. So I would avoid just dropping that terminology into an answer the way I've just kind of dropped that word into this top part, which I don't think earns the credit. I think you want to be safe, you want to be more complete, you want to elaborate. These are all different terms that your teacher uses with you the same way I use with my students. You want to elaborate, and if you're elaborating that you know about political and social cleavages in Nigeria, use a specific example. In this case, Boko Haram Islamist groups versus Christians. So the third mega point here, explain how data in the table relates to political stability. And you gotta talk about both Russia and Nigeria. So you have to talk about both. So use both of those countries' names in your answer. This is a really incomplete example that's not getting the point. So I wanted to make sure I was much more specific, giving data from Nigeria, giving data from Russia related to the number of terrorist incidents. Data in the table relates to political stability in Russia and Nigeria because both countries have the highest index scores for internal violence of countries listed, with 84.73 for Nigeria and 73.55 for Russia. For terrorist incidents, many acts of terrorism within a country can threaten political stability in both Russia and Nigeria because greater political instability can result from a government's inability to prevent random acts of mass political violence. Again, this question is not just asking you to quote data from Russia and Nigeria. The question is asking you to connect that data to explain how that data relates to this concept of political stability. I really feel strongly that if you're going to put yourself in the game to win this mega point in the quantitative analysis, or the previous two in the A and the B, try to show off that you know what that concept is by speaking about that concept, either through defining that concept or giving a contemporary example or a country-specific example of stability in Russia or Nigeria. So I suppose I could have extended this to talk about specific acts of violence in Russia and Nigeria. But I think I got to that by talking about the instability could result from a government's inability to prevent random acts of political violence. So I think I got to that mega point with that part of my explanation. So that takes care of the quantitative analysis for 3.8 and 3.9. Again, I would invite you to go back to the course description, look at those critical vocabulary words. A lot of these words connect back to previous topics, especially topics that we looked at in Unit 1. I'd invite you to share other examples you have of governmental responses to social cleavages. I know I'm running out of time. Big announcement. At Citizen U, I have posted all of the FRQs that I've written for these lessons with my sample answers. I have posted that at Citizen U. Actually, Mr. Larson posted it. Thank you, Mr. Larson. At Comparative Corner, you can get both the text messages that I use with the supplemental notes, and now you can access these FRQ questions. And I put the samples in there, the same things that you've seen in all of these video lessons from Unit 3. We will look more on the next lesson at Unit 4. If you have country-specific examples of interest groups or social movements related to Unit 4, please share those at the Twitter hashtag. I will see you again on Monday, April 27th. We'll do a day of Unit 4 review, connecting it to fair game material on this revised AP comparative exam. Thank you for tuning in to Studio Room to See, where there's always room to see how countries compare. Be well.